During the first stages of the war in the Pacific theater, the U.S. had suffered from disastrous slights from the Japanese, ranging from the unexpected attack on Pearl Harbor to a battle that ended in a draw at the Coral Sea. For the first portion of the war in the Pacific, the U.S. was forced into a defensive position in order to evade the threat of a mass Japanese invasion of the Pacific. However, the momentous battle fought at Midway helped to turn the tables and place the U.S. as the offensive force in the Pacific War effort. In order to extend their claim over the Pacific, the Japanese planned to assault and occupy Midway. By doing this, it opened up the Hawaiian island chain to an open attack from the Japanese. In occupying Midway, it would also draw the U.S. forces into a crucial battle, which would in turn determine whose favor the war in the Pacific theater would turn to. The Japanese headed for Midway with the full force of their combined fleet. Admiral Yamamoto predicted that once the U.S. had gotten wind of the assault on Midway, they would send at least their 2 to 3 remaining carriers, due to the fact that many of their ships had been lost during previous battles. However, prior to the beginning of the attack, U.S. codebreakers working for Admiral Nimitz configured coded Japanese messages and were able to anticipate an attack upon Midway. The Midway occupation fleet of the Japanese consisted of 3 forces. The 3 forces were the landing force, main battle force, and the carrier force. The carrier strike force consisted of 4 aircraft carriers coming from the northwest. The invasion/occupation force came from the west, and the main battle force, which had 2 battleships, came from between both of them. In anticipation of the attack, Admiral Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of all Pacific forces, sent out Admiral Fletcher and Admiral Bruins to defend Midway Atoll. Admiral Fletcher was assigned the Naval Task Force 17, while Admiral Bruins was assigned Naval Task Force 16. Task Force 16 was centered around 2 carriers, the USS Enterprise as well as the USS Hornet. Task Force 17 was centered around 1 main carrier, the USS Yorktown. The U.S. military forces were the first forces to strike, as the battle commenced on June 3, 1942, just 220 miles from where the U.S. forces were stationed by Midway, when U.S. bombers were dispatched and sent to seek out the Japanese fleet. After finding the Japanese fleet, the U.S. aircraft proceeded to bomb the fleet and then finally returned back to the U.S. naval fleet. However, the bombings proved to be ineffective as they did very little damage. The next morning, a fleet of Japanese Zeros bombed Midway heavily. A second fleet was sent out to destroy the airplanes that had attempted to damage the Japanese fleet the other day. This resulted in a dogfight between both the Japanese Air Forces as well as the U.S. Air Forces. The U.S. sent out 41 torpedo bombers in response to the attack from the Japanese Air Forces. At 10 o'clock, 36 U.S. dive bombers caught the Japanese ships while their decks were full with aircraft and fuel. The U.S. sank 3 carriers and 1 heavy cruiser. Spanning from June 4th to 5th, due to the loss of 4 carriers, the rest of the battle became a retreat on behalf of the Japanese forces and a pursuit on behalf of the American forces, as the Japanese retreated westward. After sinking the 3 Japanese carriers, as well as the heavy cruiser, Admiral Bruins launched a second strike against the Japanese and found the remaining 4th carrier and sunk that as well. However, during the sinking of that carrier, the Yorktown was damaged and needed to be taken back to Pearl Harbor for reconstruction. On June 6th, a Japanese submarine finally sank the Yorktown as it was being towed back to Pearl Harbor for reconstruction by the USS Hanman. The Hanman sank on the same day as it was attacked, while the Yorktown finally succumbed to its damages and sunk on June 7th. The Battle of Midway resulted in a crushing defeat for the Japanese military by taking out the strength of its naval power. This was a loss that the Japanese could never have hoped to recover from, and a success that paved a pathway of victory for the U.S. from atolls in the Pacific to the home islands of Japan.